The following is a conversation with Paolo Selva. I got in contact with Paolo years ago in context of city engine support and meetings at conferences like SIGGRAPH and FMX. We had many conversations about the complexities of 3D cities, transporting materials and shaders from tool to tool, and especially about procedural modeling. In 2019, I had the opportunity to organize a full track at the Animago conference in Munich, Germany. Obviously, the topic was 3D environments, to which I was able to invite Paolo as one of the speakers, coming all the way from Wellington, New Zealand. He presented multiple of Wētā's visual masterpieces with complex cities such as Tintin, Maze Runner 3, Mortal Engines, and Alita Battle Angel. I remember that back then we also went to see the famous BMW museum in Munich and discussed USD and future plans in life, which, in Paolo's case, now a few years later, definitely seem to have materialized. You'll hear more about it in this episode. I got to know Paolo as a truly humble, respectful, and selfless genius. Though, due to his Italian roots and physical presence, I'm convinced Paolo could also have been a formidable commander in the Roman army about 2,000 years ago. Thank you, my friend, for sharing your story with us. Stay humble, stay curious. This is the 3D Environment Podcast. And now, please enjoy the conversation with Paolo Selva. Alrighty, let's get started with this, Paolo. It's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much.
Oh, it's a pleasure for me to be here. It's I really wanted to be here with you. It's been. I guess we talked about this how many times? Even at FMX at some point, we mentioned this years ago. We never had the chance to do anything together, but this is good.
This is the first one, yeah. No, it's very, very cool. I'm so looking forward to this one because it's so rare to be able to pick the brains of a person like you and then share a little bit of that also to other people that may also be interested. And so, that's really, really cool. So thanks again. Tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of where you grew up and how you got in contact with computers.
I've grown up in a small town near Rome. So I'm from Italy and close to Rome, in a small town called Nettuno on the sea. And I guess I started since I was 6, 7 years old when I got my first Commodore 64. That was the first time that I sort of I became passionate, for computers. And so I also opened it, just to see how it was actually made inside. And I was actually able to put it back in together, which still working. So that was a good thing. I've always been into computers. That's something that I've always done. And even during, my time at high school, I tried to do all of my projects, to try to get the computer and the mix. And, science projects with some sort of 3D done with the Amiga or, whatever you could think of. I wanted to put a computer in the mix. And so the first thing that I've done was, as usual, after high school, it's going to be for university. It was, 1996, I think, when I started university, quite some time ago. There weren't really a lot of options, specifically to computer graphics. I had, I was doing some sort of 3D with 3D Studio for DOS. I was doing some things with the Amiga with various tools, but just for fun. But I really wanted to do something more higher level. But university in Rome was mainly just, you could have taken on engineering and that's it. Not really anything else related to computer graphics. And so I did take engineering and I'd done the first 2 years, I've done all of the sort of programming languages related courses. And then I got bored and I was like, how can I use the computer now? What can I do? And I found that it wasn't really what I wanted to do, engineering. And so I moved into the Department of Math, came up with the very first sort of computer graphics, math, and a bit of cinema mix course called Science and Media Communication, which was part of the Department of Math. And so I joined that one. And that was probably the best thing that I've done in my life. Like, I spent 4 years trying to get my head around. I started reading the Foley Van Damme, the book of computer graphics. I did all of my exams, one after the other. I really enjoyed it. And that one sort of got me into doing small jobs around, some of the studios in Rome that they were doing. At that time, they were doing a lot of small, I don't know if you remember, they were sending you multimedia messages with sort of promotions, ads on it, through mobile phones. That's where I started doing some sort of 3D animations for those.
Wow.
But I realized that I was okay as a 3D generalist. But the one thing that I realized always was I wanted to have a plugin to do X or another tool to do Y. And I was like, where can I find those? I'm like, well, I'm a developer. Maybe I should build those by myself. And so that's what I started doing mostly. Every time there was I had an idea of whatever I needed to do with a computer, I was like, I can just write it. And that sort of got me into the very first big project that I've done as part of my thesis at the university, which was data glove from scratch, that I could actually manipulate 3D world. It was 2001, I guess, something like that. And that sort of was the very first project that also got me into staying at the university. And we opened what we call it was a human computer interface lab, basically. It was called ISIM, which in Italian sounds like, the Interfacce Sistemi Interattivi Multimodali, which sounds like in English, multimodal interfaces for systems, let's say, right? And it was mainly a human computer interface lab. And so we were trying and testing potential interfaces between human and computers. And I stayed there at the lab and I tutored some of the courses that we had at university. And I taught programming, C and C++. And I also been teaching processing at the master for the same course. And that was pretty much my time at university, really. I went on for, I think, a few, I would say maybe, I don't know exactly how many years, but it was maybe up until 2006, kind of that. So I've been teaching and stayed at university for 5-6 years. I went with university and with the projects at the university. I also had a chance to go and visit other university like Malmo University. We went in Sao Paulo, in Brazil, and all about computer interfaces. I was working on medical devices to measure the breathing exposure, right? And so it was a lot of interesting projects, and I've met a lot of interesting people over those years. And then I decided that I actually wanted to be more involved with computer graphics, do a bit more. I loved teaching. I loved, all of the human computer interfaces, but I always had that sort of small bell in my head that said, you want to do computer graphics. And so that's where I took a big decisions to say, I need to go to London, which was the closest sort of biggest hub of all of the visual effects companies. And I went there without a job. I was like, I need to go there and find a job there.
Wow.
In London. And so I took it as a sign, because when I take a decisions, if I go full on with it, if I fully commit on it, it means that I want to do it. And so I by the time that I realized that I really want to do it, then I just have to go, and it has to be a drastic one. And so I flew over, I went there, and I've been living couch surfing for a while across, friends that were able to have me as a guest. But after a little bit, then I joined Jellyfish Pictures it was a very small company at that time. It was maybe 22 people. I was the only developer pretty much. And together with Jeremy Smith, we sort of built the infrastructure for the network, all of the systems internally. But I was pretty much the only developer. And I didn't have a lot of experience in terms of like, what can I do as a software engineer, like, for a visual effects company. And so they were also like pretty unaware of what a developer could do for them. And I was like, okay, let's figure this out together. So what are your problems? I'm going to try to solve them, writing some tools for it. You don't want to replace the artists, right? You want to work with them. You want to help them. And so I've been going around and talking to them and saying like, how can I speed your day-to-day work? And so I've started doing some plugins here and there for Fusion. And then is where I've actually built my first city builder plugin. It was
already back then.
It was 2000,
nice.
2007 or something like that. Like it was a very first, I thought about like, this way of procedurally building buildings, you made of small cells that you can put together based on different styles. And the building locations was actually based on a map that you could paint, and based on color and opacity values and brightness values. Then you could choose how high the buildings were and different styles and different colors. And that was good. It was something that I loved. It went on some magazines. Like it sort of made some noise, which was in a good way. And then a good friend of mine from Wētā sort of reached to me. It was the end of 2007. And he was like, Wētā is looking for developers. Maybe you want to try to apply for it. And I was like, okay, let's try this. But the hiring process for visual effects company could take a while. Like it's not something that, you apply, even if you're good for them.
I would assume especially for Wētā, right? Because of the, I'm not sure what the process was, but I heard you kind of need to commit for a certain amount of time. You can actually fly over, right?
That time it was at least 1 year contract. But also Wētā needs to show to the immigration that they actually need you over locals in New Zealand, right? Because they need to then give you a working visa. But instead of that, it's also like, that maybe they say, oh, we have a few slots open now. Like I didn't realize this at that time, but then while working at Wētā, I went through the process of trying to hire other developers. And I realized that you say, I got some open slots today, and you start the process of interviewing, but then maybe you don't really have those slots now. So you do the interviews, but then you wait a little bit because you don't actually have already the slots. And maybe you re-interview the same people again, like maybe after 3-4 months. And so that process could take a while. And so I did the first interview was like November, I think, 2007. Nothing happened. Like it was a good interview. But then they called me again in April. So I did another interview in 2008. And then when I did the second one in April in 2008, then it was like, I got the offer after a month or so. And then I flew to New Zealand in July, just a few months after the second interview. But, between the first and the second one took like, 6 months or so. So it was like, it took a little bit, but then I fully committed on the fact that I really needed to do something with my career. And it's from Italy, New Zealand is really on the other side of the world, like exactly on the other side of the world. So
yes, indeed.
I needed like in some way I needed to sell it to my mom and saying like, I'm going to go there for just 1 year, but it's a good one because it's Wētā, right? It's the top visual effects company. But when I'll be back, like after 1 year, then I'll go in London. It's going to be like, with Wētā on my CV, it's going to be easy. And she was like, well, okay, if it's 1 year, fine. They did the Lord of the Rings. My mom was all into Lord of the Rings. So she was like, it's a good thing. You go there, like, I enjoyed it. And after 1 year, I was like, oh, I'm going to do just another one because they're happy with me and going to stay here. And after a few years, she realized that I was not going to come back. And it's been 16 years now, and I'm still here.
You mentioned you had some friends or a friend at Wētā that actually asked you to come over or at least try to apply. I assume you were aware of a couple of projects that were going on, kind of shows. So that was Lord of the Rings was
The Lord of the Rings was done already.
That was quite some time before, but what was kind of going on regarding specifically what they were hiring for, which show, which movie?
Yeah, so I didn't know exactly which show was while I was interviewing. And also I didn't know what Wētā was working on. I knew Wētā for some of the previous shows, but I didn't really know what they were working on. And so it's only when then I did the interview and I started like signing up some documents that I was actually signing an NDA about Avatar. Like they were working on Avatar. And I was like, oh my God, okay, that's good. Like, it's a big, it's going to be the biggest James Cameron's movie next. So let's, but I didn't know what projects they were working on. But I remember the interviews that I've done. I had questions about the city builder that I've done. I had questions for what sort of solutions I was trying to implement, like how would artists use it? Those sort of questions for what I've done. And also so this friend of mine reached out to me because it's been like 16 years ago, but there were not like really a lot of places where you could go and find what I is looking for. And there was just like mainly, we had a forum with all Italians that were outside of Italy called Render Global. And we were all chatting like on those forums. And so when there was an opening somewhere else, like people were like, hey, we're looking for like, you should apply. And so this was kind of like that. But this friend of mine was a very good friend of mine. We were friends since from Rome. He went at Wētā first, then Pixar, and then back at Wētā. And so when he went back at Wētā, he was like, maybe you should come over, or at least, apply and see what happens. But and I joined as a weird role, like it was scientific coder. I was supposed to be like an expert on user interfaces. So I was mainly going to be there as sort of Qt developer, building interfaces. And I've done that maybe like the first week. And then I did something completely different. But
Nice. I mean, it's incredible, right? So 16 years. And I just checked, when was it? Yesterday, I quickly checked. You have about 38 IMDb credits, which is pretty cool.
And I stopped updating it.
And I'm just curious, pretty much all of them are from Wētā, except for chronologically, the very first one. I think it was The Day the Earth Stood
That's
Still.
from Wētā. From Wētā.
That's also from Wētā.
No, all of my credits are from Wētā. Like, I did little, like, Jellyfish at that time was doing a lot of commercials. And so we were doing commercials. We were not doing movies. And so credits were not really a thing for me before Wētā. But I joined for Avatar, but my very first fix was actually in The Day the Earth Stood Still. I made a fix for the particles that, I don't know if you remember the movie, there were nano monsters that were eating like metal. There were like a lot of a large particle system that was a swarm that was like going over and eating all of the metal things. And there was a scene with like this truck going and particles eating it like entirely. And so I fixed like the particle system. I did a fix on the particle system that Wētā has as a custom system.
That was an easy credit, right?
I guess so, yeah.
I think I remember a movie where green particles or so eat the Eiffel Tower, but maybe that's a different movie.
I think it's this. No, sorry, no, that one was it was not the part. It was a green sort of entity or things. Yeah, and I remember that. No, those were like metal particulates eating metal. And so there were like a lot of those gray things like flying around.
I see. Yeah. No, the other one was green, but I have no idea which movie that was. Anyway, so basically then you mentioned you started with interfaces in Qt.
Yeah.
So for those that don't know, Qt is basically like a library with which you can create windows and buttons and kind of interfaces. Yeah. So how did you continue after that?
Actually, that first Qt project that I've done, like in the first few weeks at Wētā, was actually the one thing that got me into rendering related tasks. Like I made a Qt interface to calculate the subsurface scattering values for the artist. They can put eyeball informations, whatever. They can see the curves and the values that they could use in the shaders for subsurface scattering. Wētā has a history of like custom tools from, they have papers for subsurface scattering, but pretty much like a lot of the tools that Wētā uses are custom built by the developers. And so for me, I sort of needed to know where to get into. I've always been into procedural geometry generation, right? That was my, it's my thing as well, now, and I'm not doing it full time, but it's what I love. But I got into rendering thanks to that one. And so that got me closer to the lighting, look dev, and rendering pipeline into writing plugins for RenderMan. I wrote shade ops and refilter for RenderMan because Wētā was using RenderMan at the time. And so we did the first avatar with RenderMan. But I was kind of fully involved then with Avatar after that sort of fix for the day the Earth stood still. And that it went on for, a couple of years. I guess we delivered it when? End of 2009?
Yeah.
Was it? Yeah. And I've done a lot of RenderMan related plugins for Avatar. There was a refilter, a plugin that was basically just custom rasterizer to analyze the complexity of the scenes. I wrote a plugin to count the hair occlusion from the lights to the shading pixel. And we also used it on Tintin later on. And, all of the hair rendering plugins, it was something that I wrote there. But yeah, it was mainly RenderMan plugins for quite a while.
Eventually, Wētā started to develop Manuka, right? And kind of obviously also other real-time visualization tools and that interface with it. RenderMan back then was and still today is very, very strong. But the decision to basically go and start your own renderer needs to have kind of massively good reasons to start a project like that and not just kind of, let's say, scale the project, a little bit back or try to collaborate with Pixar to work on some solutions. Now, I would assume there's a lot of politics going on also with you. It's hard to interface with other companies. Let's say Pixar to improve RenderMan. It's a massive investment, but I assume that was pretty much the only solid controllable solution with the fur for the apes, right? That was probably one of the most fundamental decisions to go for it, or were there other strong limitations?
So it's not kind of always a matter of limitations. For sure, you want to try to improve existing tools. And we did talk to from Pixar to even Autodesk and SideFX for all of the tools. But it's not just a matter of improving them or making them better. It's mostly there were a few things that were going on related to algorithm for rendering and how to create materials and shading. And so the sort of easy transition, to make a long story short, was that we did Avatar with RenderMan, but RenderMan was it was producing the final pixels with plugin that were actually reading point clouds. And actually we built a custom point cloud format called TopoCloud. So it had topology and not just points, but it was an actual geometrical representation of the scene. And what RenderMan was actually able to do is that our renders in RenderMan were minutes because RenderMan was only reading all of the caches as TopoClouds. And so we built a system called Pantarray. And Pantarray is the one that we used for Avatar to do all of the ray tracing of everything in the show, from creating shadows to calculate the subsurface to everything. And we were writing out of Pantarray those caches as TopoClouds, and then we were feeding RenderMan with those caches. And so the easy step was, hold on a sec, we did a ray trace, we did pretty much everything. We just need to put the last bits together to also produce the pixels. Why don't we make a renderer? And so we sort of took that as the reason to say, well, we could potentially just do the next step. And so we sort of went with, we knew how we want to do the layering materials. We knew what, various algorithms that we want to implement for hair rendering, for subsurface. And so all of those then became papers and contributions to the community from work that has been done on Manuka as a researcher and also for spectral rendering. So Manuka was, spectral renderer from the ground up.
Very fascinating. Looking back to all of those movies that you've been working on, obviously from the technical side, or mostly from the technical side and engineering, what were some of the most cherished kind of moments that you had looking back with things that really were, I don't know, fun or anything that stood out? I mean, sure, there's the Avatars and Avengers. I mean, the list is going on and on, right? Or Guardians of the Galaxy. But maybe there are some hidden gems that nobody knows that you really, really like them. I'm curious about those things. What stood out to you over the years?
Tintin is one of the projects that I have very good memories about. I wrote the hair rendering plugins that we used on Tintin. And the one thing that Tintin gave me as well was really to experience firsthand what is being in the front line, the fix on the last minute, being there to try to optimize as much as possible the renders, to go from hours down to whatever time you could save. And so I spent nights over trying to optimize various things. And at the end, what was good about it is that the VFX supervisor came back when we delivered the project and sort of congratulated with me. And I was like, it was the first time that I had that very close communication with the VFX supervisors. There were a lot of developers, and being on the front line is something that sort of made me very happy, even though I needed to do a lot of overtime and maybe sleeping, deprived of some sleeping hours probably over those overtimes. But that was it's the good memory because it initiated me to the sort of deadlines and the craziness of the last minute sort of deliveries. But then I have other two projects that I like because of two very important reasons. One is that Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, when we go in the Ego planet with all the fractals. I don't know if you remember that whole fractal world. I was head of software engineering there. And so we needed to sort of tackle the fractals, how do we do that? And so that was sort of my first way of working with some of the engineers in my department and go to dailies and try to work with the supervisors to understand what could be a good solution. So that sort of build new tools from scratch is what I remember and what was really good for me for Guardians of the Galaxy. And another tool is both Apes and Hobbit were the first shows where we started rendering with Lumberjack, our plugin for making trees. And I wrote the plugins for rendering in Renderman and Manuka. And so that's what I liked. For a software developer, it's tricky to say, what did you work on? You can't point at one specific part of the pixel unless you look through the image, with all the layers. But the fact that you could say, well, I did work on the plugin for rendering the trees, or I did work on the plugin for making the hair, that sort of, you give it a good sort of, you can point your finger at a very specific plugin. And so that is also quite a good thing. And the supervisors on those shows were amazing. And so it's working with them as well that gives you the good memories. There are supervisors that are more into technology and they really want to work with you and talk to you to just make it better. And others that just take whatever comes out of it, which is good, in any way. But those are the good memories.
It's interesting because I've heard this a lot of times where software developers, not all of them, but the ones in the creative industries, they are very happy to, in the end, if after their work is done, they can basically, you can visually see the result. I can completely relate to that also, obviously. Now, actually very recently, I recorded an episode with Chris White.
Yeah.
I'm sure you also worked with him. So tell us a little bit about that project and the collaboration with him.
Well, there were more than just a few collaborations, but I can probably just mention a couple of interesting things. So one is an interesting fact that happened. So I mentioned, the book that I studied on while I was at university is the Foley Van Damme is the book for computer graphics. It's the Bible of the computer graphics. And one of the author is James Foley. And so what is interesting is that, I don't know, but 6 years ago, 7 years ago, something like that, there is a friend of Chris White that was coming in town, like from Japan. And so Chris sort of invited me and a friend of mine to get lunch out with his friend. And together with us, there was actually James Foley. And that was like, it's the lunch that I had thanks to Chris that I met my sort of idol, like, I wouldn't say idol, but like the author of the book that I studied on at university. I was like, oh my God, I'm having lunch with James Foley. Like, is that true? Like, and I wanted to get him to sign the book. And so I went home here because I remember I got all the books here from Italy because, I wanted to have the books. And I found it. And what I realized is that I only had the cover of the book. I didn't have the book inside. There was another book inside. I was like, I can't just go there and ask him to sign it, like where the cover says, it's computer graphics, but inside is not. And I'm like, maybe I'm not gonna do that. I'm gonna skip it. So it was a funny, interesting story. But with Chris, one thing that actually had to do with him, like quite a lot, is Chris and Marco Revelant, they worked on the CityBot, which was the plugin that they used for making the city on Kong, right? On the very old, not the very old, like the first Kong that Wētā did when they needed to build New York. And when I did the presentation about environments, I think it was FMX some years ago. I don't remember exactly. Animago, yes, thanks. Yeah. I sort of went through like, I wanted to show what environments we build. And so I had to spend a lot of time like with Chris and go through like, the presentations that he did in the past, try to build like, presentation for this. And then we ended up like together also looking at building a procedural buildings plugin for one of the show that we were working on at that time. It didn't went on. Wētā tried various things for procedural building creation, but we never really came up with something that it was worth it to build it internally, because there are so many alternatives out there, like, from City Engine and even directly straight in Houdini, you can now do it. So we didn't really go like with our implementation, but we did try to get on, and Chris White was involved and Marco as well, because obviously they had experience with the previous implementation. But then for that project, we actually went on with City Engine. So that's, but we got it working to a certain point. And then in software development, you need to value like how much is yes, you can make any tool, but there is a cost in maintaining it. There is a cost in, recompile if the developers leave. And, there are a lot of things that you need to consider. Yeah. And if an off-the-shelf solution works, then go with the off-the-shelf solution.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I also had talked to him about that, Kong especially also. And yeah, it's just a very hard topic. It's like creating realistic and convincing 3D cities is just very, very challenging. And he actually just mentioned to me when I met him, so I met him physically twice this year, once in Kenya in about April, and then a month later, approximately a month later again in Stuttgart at the FMX conference. And he said it's still kind of an unsolved problem, and he would love to have like a proper tool that solves these things. Yeah. But yeah, I mean, every company has different needs, and every project also has different needs. So it's very hard to have something that is versatile enough.
Yeah, procedural tools are tricky because you cannot have a one-button solution that solves the problem, because it's not like you want to have enough controls to allow the artist to exactly know what they can get. Yeah. When setting all of the parameters. It's not something that you say, yes, I can procedurally build a forest. Well, okay, now move 2 leaves, away from it. Well, it's like how many times you're going to try to reproduce it up until you get the right thing. So that's the trickiest part is, how many controls and how can you give full control to an artist to come up with a good procedural system. Yeah,
that's exactly what we've been working on internally, like for a long time here in my company. And I know the limitations of kind of purely procedural systems very well. And then also kind of the art directability. Where do you start? What are the typical steps that you need to do in layout? Like laying out the city and leave certain places empty. We're going to put some hero assets or like whatever landmark buildings or whatever that are manually built and so on. But then also be able to have a system that spits out kind of logical architectural structures that are also still controllable afterwards. It's very tricky. We're still working on it. But yeah, I fully agree that procedural systems are good, but they also have certain limitations. And some we're in-house trying to kind of marry the two. But it's still quite some time to go until we have it figured out. We're on a good way, though.
Yeah.
But I mean, let's talk a little bit more about the challenges in 3D environments in general. So what's harder, natural environments like forests or cities? Because, I mean, you worked on all of that stuff, right? You developed the tools and you also created procedural systems for both of those worlds and the mix in between.
So, I mean, I would say that the forests is probably the trickiest compared to a more organized system like built by humans, like, cities have rules that we made. And so as long as we can potentially recreate those rules, we could potentially just make the cities again. But mimicking nature is a whole different story. But it's not just that one. It's also like, it's how you want to build a complexity of a forest without going with like the uniqueness of like what nature can actually produce. Like, if you look at a forest with 10,000 trees, in nature, those are 10,000 different trees. You're not going to be able to have 10,000 unique trees in your CNG environment. Like, you're going to, explode your render, your memory will blow up. So you need to find solutions to come up with something with it, right? Like, so a building, you might be able to chop it in pieces and try to instance some parts, and it's going to be okay. You can do like, a lot of those things. If you try to instance the same trees multiple times, you will notice that those are not, different trees. And so it won't look like a realistic forest. So it's trickier in that part. And the other trickiest step is to try to have the same plants, but like deformed, because maybe like, plants will redirect to some light sources, or maybe the wind, like, deformed some of them. So that's sort of the uniqueness of those things is coming from a lot of factors that it's not easy to replicate. And so I think a forest environment is very tricky to make it realistic enough that you can buy that is actually a real forest. And not because of from the 10,000 feet view, like, if you look from far away, that's okay. You can come up with some sort of forest that looks kind of realistic. It's when you fly in and then you get below the canopies that it's going to be tricky.
Yeah. Especially if everything is bioluminescent and has to bend and
without specific movies in mind, yes.
So you mentioned Lumberjack before, and looking also back to other tools that were originally developed in the context of Wētā, so Massive being one of them, that got basically released as a commercial product or a piece of software. And then later on also the other famous tool is Mari, that kind of got extracted and got over to the foundry to be developed. So assuming, or what would it take to take Lumberjack and commercialize it? Would that be something that is feasible, or is that something that would be, I don't know, too disruptive on the market? I don't know.
No. It's a very good question. It's a very good question. Especially because you might know what happened, with the whole Unity situation, right? Like, Unity.
Just heard rumors, but
You heard rumors. I can give you more details about it. But first, I want to mention one thing. Like, Massive and Mari were two special things. Like, they've been created and built in a time where there were not other solutions available, right? So there was very easy, I would say, like, to get into the market. And Wētā internally continued using, like, our own CAT. Like, we didn't, use the commercial version. We had our version with all of the hooks for our pipeline and whatever. So, but the trickiest part is to actually take a tool that might be already available in other forms. Like, Lumberjack has a lot of similar tools, like, SpeedTree and, again, Houdini, you can build procedural plans with Houdini. But all of our tools are made so that they can actually work together also in a nice way. Like, they fit together in the pipeline properly. There are some tools that you can extrapolate from the pipeline and make it usable by others in isolation. And that's what Unity tried to do. So Unity came in, 2021, I think. And they decided to buy all of the Wētā tools and all of the developers. And so the 270 developers plus everything we wrote in the previous years.
Yeah.
So the whole technology ended up as being owned by Unity. And the idea originally was that Unity was going to productize some of them, because that's what you want to do. You spend a lot of money to just buy the whole technology. You want to get some, money out of it. And so they started looking at what can we extrapolate from the pipeline. And Wig and Lumberjack, Cine Designer, the tools for building environments, Totara, which is the tool to actually grow forests, not just individual trees. All of them, they were like, well, those are authoring tools. Maybe we can just package together individually and sell them, maybe sell licenses. I don't know, market-wise, I have my opinion about how this was going to be doing, which is actually something that Wētā was going to be doing before Unity. But Unity decided to sort of have smaller products and try to sell them as individual products. But to do that, you need to just get them to pay a license for a tool that, yes, it's a tool that has been used for making movies, but it's a tool that has been built for the artists that actually made those movies. And so they were good with it because it's a technical tool that those guys were actually able to use and make, very, very good use of it. And it fit the pipeline very well. And so it was working with, we make a tree in modeling, we simulate it in FX, and then we render it in Manuka. And all of those steps are all working together with Lumberjack in it. If you take it just for ordering trees, you're producing just a bunch of polygons and a lot of data that might not even be good for rendering as it stands if you don't use Lumberjack for rendering as well, or if you don't use Lumberjack for deformation and simulation. So all of that was kind of not really going anywhere. But Wētā initially wanted to sell Wētā as a service. You go into the cloud. And so we had this Wētā M, Wētā H idea where you go on the cloud and you have the Wētā pipeline. Yeah. And that was probably a much better way to say you step in a pipeline where you have all the tools available. You can go from authoring your models to rendering them with Manuka at the end. Just get on a fully working pipeline and just buy how many hours you want. Yeah. You go there. Yeah. That was probably going to be a much better...
It's like a Wētā tools as a service, right?
that was one of the original ideas, but it never really went on, with after the acquisition with Unity. But it's sad. It's a sad story.
Yeah, there was some announcement, obviously, also of those tools, and that they never manifested in the end. And you guys Wētā got the people back in the end, right? Plus the
we got rehired. We call it the Unity blip. It happened as the 2 years blip.
Yeah. I'm not sure how far one should go into this rabbit hole, but there was definitely one of those things. And but I mean, going back to kind of taking certain tools and then pushing them to the market, if they are if they are made specifically for working in tandem with other very specific tools in a pipeline, then it's very hard to take them out, right?
And there could be a lot of work to try to make them usable by the masses. We make it that technical artists know that they need to press 10 different steps to get what they want.
Yeah.
It's not maybe easy to just say, make a tree or, It's complicated tools.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look at how long it takes to, I don't know, just get into the basics of Houdini as an artist.
Yeah.
And then now do the same thing again to, I don't know, learn a couple of specific tools. So that's also, I mean, Scanline is a fantastic example. We'll go a little bit more into this later on, but now a couple of months ago, you started to work at Scanline, right? So when I was working at Scanline between 2005 and 2006, the pipeline back then was very, very strongly using Max and Maya. Originally, kind of their foundation was purely in 3D Studio Max, but then suddenly they had all of these processes that needed to push the tools through the pipeline to go from tool A to tool B. I actually asked my visual effects supervisor back then, was a fantastic guy, Mosavi, shout out. So why is that? And he said there's a very simple reason. So the company is investing massively to basically adopt Maya into the pipeline, just simply because all of the animators are using Maya, right? So otherwise if you want to hire the talent and if you want to, I don't know, scale as a company, you need to basically bow to the market, right? And then again, if people are used to other tools, why would they just adapt to a new tool set that is available now?
Yeah.
Right?
No, that's very true. And it's one of the problems that we had over time at Wētā because of too many custom tools that, artists coming from outside, they didn't really know, we had a procedural, authoring tool for making hair, barbershop, wig, for making trees, for making braids, for making feathers, for building environments, for rendering, custom shaders. You can't take artists out of the, yes, animators, we animate in Maya, so animators are good. Effects, we have a custom tool called Loki for making simulations. So it's full integrated with Houdini, but still takes a little bit maybe to just learn how those things are actually working. And so it's like the learning curve and joining companies that have custom tools, it's high, it's very steep.
Yeah, and I mean, even if you had access to Wētā's pipeline as a service in the cloud, to basically evaluate whether this would be financially feasible in the end is really hard. It's really hard because for people to fully trust the tools, they need to basically relearn a lot of their existing knowledge and then do a project and see how it comes out. And that's a massive investment, right? That especially companies, let's switch the pipeline. Okay, no, we may not be productive for 2 to 3 months, right? Yeah. So that's a massive risk.
Even so, you said something that is very true. The idea of having the Wētā as a service was to sort of get people from outside of Wētā to familiarize with our tools. But then we needed to build scenes to make example files, right? And so we cannot use any of our existing scene that has been built so far because Wētā doesn't own any of it. Everything that we built, that Wētā built, is for it's owned by the clients, and mostly Marvel and Disney and whoever. So every time we sort of needed to, hey, let's build an example scene, that maybe we can make it available. Oh, let's find some artist time. Oh, we don't have it. Oh, okay, we're not going to build it.
Yeah, also the whole content, right? I mean, let's assume you would take a studio that has, I don't know, let's say 40 artists that are going to use a workbench like this, Wētā Tools as a service. Now, will they ever have the time and the budget to braid hairs on an orc's, I don't know, arm, right? Maybe they have the tools available, but only certain types of budgets will even kind of unlock that you can use certain tools.
And also you don't have to use, not just because you have those tools, you have to use them. It's not, some of the things that we build, they are good for on the long run. When you know that, you're not gonna, if you have a Ferrari, you're not gonna take the Ferrari to go to the supermarket, let's say. You might take another car right? Because it's going to cost you a lot.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then if you're actually going and want to be very fast, I don't know, whatever is the reason to own a Ferrari, then you want to use the Ferrari. But so we built a lot of the tools also, like, knowing what was actually going to be needed and how we were going to be using and how they were going to save in the long term. Yeah. And that one, you don't like, you put all of those tools in the hands of the artists, like those 40 artists, like, it's, I don't know what they can actually do. Like it's,
which then also kind of immediately leaves you to the issue of, okay, now if you want to go to the masses that are very typically a lot smaller, let's say just the visual effects studio is a lot smaller than Wētā with 2,000 plus employees, right? And now you basically say, okay, here are the tools. And then they say, okay, how much is it going to cost? Well, we're not going to use this, and this, and this. And then you have the problem of the granularity of the subscription to which tools do you want to actually have access to. And then also this managing the licensing and the installation of the different modules and plugins. It's a nightmare to manage.
The easiest thing would have been just like use it as it is.
Yeah.
And buy the hours, like, you just get hours on the machine.
I mean, why not? I see another option, but I think that's also maybe a political thing or whatever, to basically open up more Wētā offices worldwide that use the tools. But then again, it's not a scalable thing, right? In the sense of like software.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's
you're just a programmer, right?
If I were going to buy Wētā tools, then I would have done like the Wētā service put it online. And because you mentioned talking to Pixar to get Render Man improved, right? Like they're not going to listen to one customer to improve it, even if it is Wētā. Like, it's not, hey, can you make it that it does X? It's like, well, sure, but yes, you are the only customer. Like we're not we're not your developers.
Yeah.
We are developing for the community that is actually using RenderMan. And so that's going to be the same. Like, the users of the Wētā tools would have been there just saying, hey, can you add this? Like, I don't know. No, just use it as it is because that's how we are using it. We can't just, work for the others as well. I mean, it would have been tricky as a situation, but
it's a different industry. I mean, Unity originally is obviously from the games industry, right? And if you look at the structure of Unity, also it doesn't have like 70 subcomponents. It's just Unity's, I don't know what the versions are, like Pro and Standard, something like that. So you have two versions, right?
Yeah. It's weird.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
I think you said correctly. It's probably political at some point. Something happened. And I don't know exactly what were the steps that went wrong or whatever, but
we'll never know.
No, we'll never know.
Yeah. Well, if you don't know, I will certainly never know.
Well, you might know more than me. Like, I don't want to know much about it anymore. But
yeah. No, that's the other side. Do you really want to know? Yeah. So, I mean, you worked on a bunch of different procedural technologies on kind of also, and on a lot of other things. I remember having chats with you regarding, I don't know, different BRDF like things of kind of shading the eyeballs and kind of the inside of the eyes and so on. So there's so much going into just in general in Hollywood blockbusters. There's so much technology, so much research and effort going into all of the little details. It's incredible. I mean, you mentioned before you were head of software engineering for some time and among other roles, but so you must have had a very, very good overview over all of the technical things kind of going on in Wētā or at Wētā. So what would you say were the most challenging aspects of managing kind of the beast? Is it more just the creative tools, designing them so that they are also intuitive to the artist? Or is it more the things like data storage or file transfer or rendering like physical phenomena, so kind of shader-based things or support of legacy code? Because, so far we've been talking about things that are very intuitive to use as an artist, like Mari. Yes, it's used for texturing, right? But there's so much more going on in that iceberg, basically. So what would you say are the most overlooked aspects that you see in managing the technical aspects of visual effects production?
There are a lot of aspects from, you mentioned even the data storage or how to handle large amount of data. And when you start looking at each one of them, you start noticing that they're all interconnected. If you start from data storage, sure, you can definitely buy more if you want, but then it's more power. But then how much power can you actually get into the storage? Do you have enough? Maybe you're already on the limit. So, okay, let's try to reduce the data. Okay, let's see how each plugin is writing their own data format. Do we want to start looking at some compression systems? Is Blosk better than Zilli? How much data are we actually writing? The reason why we have a lot of procedurals is that we don't have to bake a per frame hair when we do animation. We deform at least the majority of it in real time. And so there is a specific reasons why we say we do it in this way, because we know that it's not just because we're fancy, we can write deformers for whatever thing we want. No, there are benefits that you can see them across other different areas. Imagine data transfer. It's not a matter of if you are in the same building, in the same country, transferring 50 gigs, it might be not a problem. But if you start having your data that crosses countries, then it's going to be a problem. And so if the data is dynamically produced at render time, that's actually much better. So how much can you actually do that? But then you have to consider how much it's going to cost you in maintaining that plugin for that specific host. And so we wrote plugins for Maya, we wrote plugins for Motion Builder, for Katana, for Houdini. And every time there was a new release of any library, a new Maya, a new version of Katana, how many different variations of our compiled softwares do we need to release? How long it takes to recompile everything. So that is a cost that you say, well, do we reduce it? But then if you reduce it, you're going to have to buy more data storage, say, as to go back to, that's why I said, it's everything interconnected. But the trickiest part is to try to see what is going to buy us more, in the long term. How do we make sure that what we do today, it's going to be useful as well, moving forward in a few months or in a few years? And so a lot of the tools that we wrote, we still use them. It's not something that you say, it's very rare that we wrote something for just a show. Well, aside of, some of the fractal tools that we wrote for Guardians of the Galaxy, but because we didn't have any other tool. Any other show that had a lot of fractals, but maybe if it happens again, we will have it. But, that's kind of where balancing that with how many resources you got, how much time do you have to invest in the pre-production for the show? Do we need new tools? Do we need to maintain it? It's that part is the trickiest part, more than just say, can we build a new BRDF? Can we build a new procedural tool? That one we can. We know that we can do it, but do we have to? Can we support it in the long term? That part, the managing part of all of that it's been the trickiest bit, for me over those years as head of department. As a developer, I would write a new tool, now for anything.
Yeah.
But as a manager, I was there and try to say, okay, well, how much artist time would that cost you if we don't do that?
Yeah.
Can you just go with it? How much time would it cost, to extend some of the render wall, to more nodes or larger hard drives or whatever? That's all of those are constant meetings that would go on to figure out do we need to embark in a long-term investment for new software, for whatever?
So that aspect, just trying to understand the structure, also a little bit of where in the quote-unquote hierarchy you were and what it means in the sense of kind of being head of software engineering for some time, what that means in the sense also of the responsibilities. Because I'm fascinated by this, and I'm asking these things obviously also because of the audience has an opportunity now to learn with me as we're going. So in general, in your position, you were definitely part of those decisions, and I assume you would have to, I don't know, produce flow charts and kind of balancing all of these things, so that was part of the game. I would assume you probably also created some tools or things to create those charts, in the sense of, I don't know, just because you know the pipeline so well that you would be able to, I don't know, extract some statistics, like literally tackle the problem from an engineering point of view, where you might have a big advantage over just somebody that is not technical and at all and can just say, okay, what does it cost? Because you have a much you have the capabilities to do much more informed decisions.
So Wētā went over various different pipelines. We rebuilt new pipelines over the years. What we always had, Joe Letteri, Wētā's senior VFX supervisors. I keep saying ours, but I'm not Wētā anymore. Joe Letteri has been over the years, sort of has been the CTO and, not officially the CTO, but the whole technology was driven by Joe. And there were the 4, 5, 6 of us that he was calling, and we were all sitting together because we were those involved over the years in building the new tools and understanding what we were coming from. And so over those 16 years, I've had the opportunity to work across various different areas. And I spent so before head of software engineering, I had a very short time as head of R&D. That time was when we did not have a CTO and we did not have a sort of group of people that were in charge of R&D globally across Wētā. And so I was that person. I don't want to deal with just licensing and other bits like this. So we do need a CTO. We do need another person. And so I said, I'm going to cover this for some time, but we also need to restructure Wētā in some better ways. And so then is when we built different other departments, and we made it more that we had a production and a technology and research group. And the technology and research group is the one that has research for simulation, research for rendering, pipeline, and engineering. And so I then took the software engineering department in those 4 sort of larger groups in TNR. And so as one of the head of the departments of those 4 groups, together with the others, we were involved in those sort of conversations with Joe to say, how do we want to approach this? Where do we go? Do we want to use Intel CPU instead of AMD CPUs? Do we want to test them? Do we want to see how do they affect what is a better GPU that we should, then we wrote tools for testing, to get reports out of it and figure out cost and everything else with IT heads and others, and say how much it's going to cost if we do this and if we do that. All of that it took a while. That part, I liked it, but I'm really more into the practical part of the engineering. Even though I love supervising and technically supervising a lot of the projects with very smart developers. You have a chance to learn a lot from PhDs just working with them. But that's where there were a lot of reports that also were needed, because R&D usually is also financed by the government. And so there is also that other part that you need to consider. If the government can actually finance some of the R&D, how do we split the work? How do we try to be in that sort of, moving the economy around R&D in New Zealand? How can we be part of it? And so there was a lot of that as well while I was in the department.
Yeah. And I believe that's a very smart move also, kind of to create some ties with the government, because it makes it probably easier to get some international talent. All right, potentially.
Kinda. No, but the one thing that it buys you is that you can get students from local universities if you collaborate with the university to try to build proper courses. You go and tutor. We tutored a lot of projects, over engineering and computer graphics courses at the university in Wellington. And we took on board a lot of students that were finishing their masters, their PhDs. And there, maybe you get some smart people out of it.
Interesting. Yeah, it's an entire world that is, or what you're describing, these processes, managerial side of things, the financing side of things, and steering this ship is a world that is very, very, very hard to access and kind of look into what these mechanisms are. This is why I feel a little bit blind in the sense of kind of walking in a dark room, but I'm really interested to see all of these dynamics, and it's actually something that is also described in Ed Catmull's book Creativity Inc. Right? So how do you keep this huge ship afloat after it is successful? Right? By far, most people are, let's say, entrepreneurs are thinking, how can I get this ship started? And then afterwards, they can say, okay, now I made it. But that's just kind of half of the truth. Or actually, Catmull says it's actually harder to keep it afloat afterwards, because the more solid you have a certain structure of the company, the harder it's accessing the information from kind of through the steps of typically the hierarchy. Right.
No, that is very true. That is very true. Like one of the things that when I started at Wētā, we didn't have any structure. Yeah. We were all, well, first of all, we were all working on Avatar. There were not that many shows aside of one or two more. And Joe Letteri was the one coming in your office and saying, I need you come with me. We're going to work on this, right? Like there were no processes in the middle to say, like what happened, like maybe after now, 15, 16 years, where you say there is a new project, like there is a much like strict hierarchy now. And then you can't just have one that says, we're going to start a new project. Like, no. Like we need to see the resources. We need to see like which movie we want to put it on. Yeah. Let's see the movies that are coming in. What do they need? Let's see if we want to do this project. And so then you say, okay, we're going to make a project pitch. We're going to have an internal evaluation of that. Like, would it be good? Like, let's see if we want to greenlit it. Like that process now, it's becoming a much longer process before you say we can make something out of it, which in a way I don't like, but in the company became more and more corporate sort of dynamics, which obviously you need it to have in a company that has grown like, this much. And obviously there is a cost in even actioning any new project that you want to evaluate with, executive producers and production going on with movies and, whatsoever.
Yeah. The structure gives stability. It's kind of in the word, right? And also the more staff you have, the more you want to make sure that the company will stay afloat, because a lot of families depend on the existence of the company, right? That makes sense. And exactly also because of those, let's say, human dynamics and information, every hierarchy level is basically a barrier also for information, or can be. And that's also why I thought about it before, whether you have written some tools for, let's say, diagnosing certain processes. It's also something that, like, the logs don't lie, right? And kind of you can get some statistics, but then also kind of you have the raw information, or at least certain like timesheets or whatever, and CPU cycles, and then actually compare to what do you hear from the kind of the human side, and then see if both sides actually match, which is incredibly important to do, right? Yeah.
No, we wrote tools like for capturing and profiling pretty much everything that was happening. But then also we needed a data scientist person. And so, we also hired a data scientist to make some sense out of those numbers. But one of the trickiest thing to do as well is like forecasting renders, right? Like, how could you know that you can take on n number of shows, consider the amount of CPU power you got, like, the amount of GPU that you need, like how many tasks are running on GPUs versus on CPUs, how busy would the CPU wall be compared to the GPU one, what shows do they need GPUs, do they need CPUs? Like, there is all of that. Like, you can't just blindly say yes to everything, and you can't just blindly, buy something new.
Yeah. It's eye-opening to look into these things that you were part of. So that's really, really cool. And I mean, seeing the track record that you had at Wētā by moving through a couple of different roles and now also having moved on to become a principal software engineer at Scanline, this all sounds like a lot of success, a lot of big wins, right? But also you must have seen quite a lot of, let's say, technical issues and also failures. So I want to move on a little bit kind of into philosophy. And so how do you personally deal with failure? Do you accept it or do you not accept it and kind of just grind on? That's kind of the first part of the question. The second one is, how do you teach as head of X, head of department or team lead and so on? How do you teach dealing with failures?
So failures are just part of the job we do. We don't just make success. We just have to know that we have to possibly fail and deal with whatever is the outcome of that failure. So always be prepared of the worst if it happens. And over the years, there were things that sort of failed and we needed to deal with it. And it's just part of the job. You cannot assume that, first of all, you need to make the engineers in your department, you need to make them comfortable in a situation where you're not kind of demanding, always 100%. It's things could happen, things could go wrong, absolutely. The one thing that I've tried to say, and I try to push on my developers as a way of viewing things, is that since we are in a very fast sort of environment where Wētā doesn't stop, the movies are, the shows must go on. And so you're not going to say there is downtime and we can rethink about something. We are constantly, that meme of the engineers fixing the airplane engine while it's flying. Well, that's exactly how the R&D pipeline works, in visual effects in general. It's not
in general. Yeah.
And so what I've tried to tell the developers is that, well, first of all, that happens and we just need to jump on it and we just do it and, we just fix it. But the other thing is also starting the new projects. When we say we want to work on something, do not try to get input, sit back, wait, weeks and months and then come up with a solution, because that might not be the exact way of doing it, because maybe it's not a solution that the artist wants. Maybe it needs to be redone. So constant communication, with who are the stakeholders is important. Rapid prototyping, some of the initial POCs, some of the proofs of concept of how it could potentially work, get an idea of that. And also there is an interesting things that I found it also lining up with my way of thinking, from Joel Spolsky wrote, it's an engineer and a writer of a book nice called Smart and Gets Things Done. And it's he sort of came up with this idea of you sort of fix it twice when there is a problem. Because what you want to do, especially in situations where the machine is going, you want to come out with a very fast fix. It gets the artist moving on. It doesn't stop production. Put it out there in just a matter of hours. Just put it out there. Do a very fast fix and then refix it properly while the fix is out there working. So you do have to. So create your own downtime in fixing it twice. And that actually works. And I've come up with that sort of way of working with the developers where you might have to also fix it. Don't consider that Wētā is not a software company. We don't produce software. We produce pixels, and you cannot stop production. And that means that, sure, you want to have QCs, you want to have review, code reviews. You can have whatever you want that you can make the tool. But in any way, you're not gonna cover all of the possibilities in which it could crash, in which it could actually not work. And so there is a balance that you need to understand in between. I'm going to spend hours in making, unit tests, regression tests, and then make a release. It could still break. So you might actually better off spending more time in make the fix, put it out there, and fix it again if it's broken, than try to keep, the unit test going. Maybe you need to update the unit test, because that's the other problem. Just like documentation, you did a big one, you did a lot of unit tests, then you have to maintain them. You can't just keep them behind with the technology and maybe they don't run anymore and then you stop them. Like if you really want to add something, then maintain it. Otherwise, you're better off not adding it at all.
Yeah. Documentation is, I've had to do some documentation work also when working in the City Engine teams. It's gruesome, right? Especially you have a new version is out, 3 buttons have changed, and then so you need to redo all of the screenshots.
Yeah.
So I just thought, hey, that would be very cool to basically extract the documentation directly from the source code with machine learning and say, hey, this is what the code is actually doing. Just write the documentation. But it's not that easy, right?
No. And also, like, one thing that we found is that over the years, you might have a tool that has a lot of features. Mm-hmm. And then you don't want to spend time documenting like everything if not used. So just get the artist to do the documentation. Get like, one of the best technical artists that knows the tool to say, hey, just write a few pages about it. We'll take care of the developers' documentation, why we made a function of 5,000 lines instead of splitting it into multiple functions for whatever reason, why we use templates and whatever, but the rest should be the artist doing documentation for the artists. Yeah.
There's also another really cool anecdote from Scanline is obviously they got big using Flowline, right? So I remember there was also one of those fun details that I heard is I said, well, something like, hey, I'm working at Scanline. Can I have a look at the Flowline documentation? I'm just curious. And they said, well, there is one, but it's not yet, let's say, polished or finished and so on. And by the way, for a long time, it did not exist. I was like, what do you mean it doesn't exist? It specifically was never made. So because it could potentially leak as basically a protection of the IP. So nobody is literally making screenshots because the screenshots could potentially leak, because it's the bread and butter of Flowline, the little company that develops it, and then obviously Scanline that uses it. And I was like,
that's weird, yeah.
That's going really far in protecting the IP, right? But it's a fun anecdote.
No, that's interesting. Probably because even Scanline has multiple, it's a company that spans across multiple countries, and that documentation definitely goes over multiple countries. Yeah. We didn't have this problem like we had, internet segregation, and pretty much everyone is in New Zealand. But
Yeah. No, and I mean, that's a story that I heard, but it does make sense. So it's basically you can learn it just by doing it and by asking questions. So going back to philosophy, so to you, what does the term career mean, and has this meaning changed over time?
That's a good question. So I've realized a few things about career, and that not for me, but for normal developers, career is important. Like it's the one thing that they ask you first. Like you get to interviews and they're like, so what is the career path like in this role? And I'm like, that's a very good question. So over time, also when I was in the department, we sort of built like some of the steps for career growth. Where would you go next? And I found that a lot of developers are really interested in helping this part, and really as part of the job that they do in the company, they also want to be involved in this matter, getting career growth and the understanding of where is the path going, what are all the steps that someone has to do. And we have, I've been very lucky to have a lot of my developers who really want to be like this, even tutoring others and being involved in conversations about where to go next. And then we took it also when we introduced a lot more like departments for crew managers and HR and talent and culture. Like, we went on like, okay, what are all the steps? Like, how do we include this? Like, do we do the usual 3, 6, 9 months meetings over the year contract? Like, how do we do like, the objective and key results? How do we look at like, what you want to do outside of the work? Like all of that is something that obviously when I started, I was like, work. I just want to do my job. Like, I don't care, like whatever it is. But obviously that's important, like, especially as you said, like, when you got a family, when you say like, am I growing? Am I going anywhere next?
Yeah.
And that's actually what sort of I tried to realize myself when I was trying to decide what am I going to do next. Like I've reached a position where there wasn't really a next level in terms of going, right? And I was like, what am I going to do? Like, do I want to do like 16 more years here? What is my next step in thinking about it and being more like the developers that I had in the past? What is the next step over this? Looking at various friends as well, the next step is quite often I'm gonna open my own business. I'm like, should I do that? That opens a lot of other issues and problems that you have to deal with.
Oh, tell me about it.
I know. So not gonna touch that part. But what I really was looking for was, well, I actually, in the past 4 years at Wētā, I've been involved with Solaris and USD. And since I became the head of the department, I was actually even more open to talk about what Wētā is doing, because I think that the open community, whether it's from open software to actually providing how we work internally, was actually a good thing because of getting better at communicating with the others, getting someone else to know exactly how Wētā works. So then interviews are actually easier because people were coming, they were like, what do you guys do internally? I don't know, like, but me going around and talking about our tools and, doing presentations about how we work internally, that was something that I really thought it was going to be useful for Wētā. And so in getting even closer and closer to the open source community and Solaris and USD, and especially USD, I thought like, well, what I want to do next is actually being first more involved with USD and actually get USD everywhere as much as I can. Like that's been like my way of thinking about it, like in terms of what I wanted to do next. And not that I want to become a USD evangelist, but whatever role would have put me in a position to say, I can spend some time with you to see how you can adopt USD.
Yeah.
Like that's the one thing that and so this sort of scanline contract in a way is kind of that one.
Yeah.
I know I was doing that with Wētā as well, because Wētā was moving to Solaris and USD, but I needed to change the environment. I needed to get in another environment that I was not going to see. I want to get the company move forward because Wētā has been part of my life. And so I needed to step into an environment where I'm going to just work with you to get OpenUSD done. And that's it. That is my task, right?
I see.
I don't want to be how do you call it? Like, the strings attached. I had much more than just a work relationship with Wētā. Like that was, for me, it was part of my life.
Yeah.
And so I needed to change the whole thing entirely. And also, in a way to say, I've been at Wētā for so many years that I don't know what's going on in the other companies as well. And so maybe, as a curiosity, but OpenUSD in a way sort of moved me in this other direction of being more involved with communities out there, being more present and providing examples of how it can be used. And I think that's what I want to do next, like, when I grow up, I want to do this. But yeah, and I think it's important, like, career is definitely something that if you know already where you're going to be like in the next few years, that's like, you are the luckiest person across all, like, because it's definitely not easy.
I also found over the last couple of years that it's a lot of people use the term, like, I want to have a career. And this is also why I'm sometimes asking these questions in the podcast. What do you mean by the term career? How do you define success? Because I did kind of in my own progress over the last couple of years, I looked into these things. What do these things actually mean to me? And it's definitely something that is very hard to define. It's very, very subjective.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of, let's say, social influence from the community or everybody that we were in contact with. And we have there's very often these terms are kind of only just kind of superficially defined and are just, very tricky to make people also understand of, hey, you may have an idea, but really try to dig deeper what you actually mean by these things.
Yeah.
And it's very hard and takes a long time. Yeah.
Yeah. And like I had developers that were also interested in just the title, right? For them, career is progressing with title, getting better title every once in a while. Yeah. I've never been that into the title. Like for me, I was always more interested in the content, getting experience on something. Yeah. And on this note, I remember Bruce Lee used to say that the belt is actually there just to keep up the pants. And that's it. It doesn't matter which color that is. It doesn't make who you are just because you have the black belt. It's and to me, I guess that there are I've seen a lot of people going on with careers just because of a title, but not really getting into it. The big titles, changing companies often. It's well, what do you really do there with that big title? You didn't really get into the company and made it something else. I think the experience is in some way better than just the title itself.
Yeah. Fully agree with that. But it's something that you need to realize these things. You need to be really open also to yourself, right? Yeah. So what are some of the best advice you got during your career, and who did you get this advice from?
That's interesting. Yeah. I've got everything that I am today and everything that I became over the past few years, I own it not just for individual advices, but even the way of working and dealing with the R&D and dealing with projects and dealing with the stressful environment and all of it. I've got it from the people that I worked with, and the majority of it's probably from my ex-visual effects supervisor, Joe Terry, but from a lot of maybe just a couple of very good friends at work that I had the opportunity to work with. And some of the ways of approaching the problem, some of the ways of not just from a software developer standpoint, but even how to interact in meetings. You don't study to you go to your university path and you become a software engineer. You haven't done any training to actually be in a meeting with a VFX supervisor and the clients on the other side, and someone asking for, well, can we make it this way? And you, from your young age, just arrived in the visual effects industry, try to say, sure, we can build it. And then slowly realizing that that's the worst thing you can do. Never commit in anything in a meeting. But no one is gonna, you don't study that at university, right? That's something that slowly comes. So a lot of those things, I had the opportunity to have a couple of good friends that sort of followed me over the years at Wētā. Luca Fascione, one of them. It's one that I probably own the most for my years at Wētā. And it's not just a single advice. It's a lot of them that made me go through all of my roles, that made me what I am today. From the small things, also, no one taught me, how to be a manager. Yeah. You don't, you're just there because someone because you spoke with someone, because you learn from others. So that's how you sort of get assured. Then you can start reading, start getting sense of where am I? what have I done? But then at some point you have to just go on with it. And so one of the biggest things that I've learned over the years at Wētā is that if there is a problem, there is probably a solution. We just need to find it. Yeah.
I'm looking forward to the book, by the way. The book on advice. What would you name it? a Paolo's Tale or something.
It's more like probably a sci-fi book. No, I don't know. I actually wrote a couple of books that I should probably get out there. More like stories. I have my head spins, like, with ideas, with millions of things. And I'm like, I should probably put them down and
do that.
Make something out of it.
Do that. Absolutely do that. I mean, there's so much wisdom you have to share, I think, and I'm glad I'm asking. I'm glad I'm trying to tap into that well, and it's something that is so valuable and not done enough to talk to wise people.
I hope people will get it as wise advices and not this crazy person.
Well, I think you got to be a little bit crazy to work in the creative industries in general, right?
That's true. That's true. That's definitely true.
All right. So going into your future, you mentioned USD as a kind of a little bit of an evangelist now, kind of going into that role at Scanline. Looking at USD or OpenUSD because as the name implies, it's basically a scene description, talking about 3D objects in a specific relationship with animation and so on and so on. What's your opinion, kind of to go a little bit down this generative AI route, just for a very brief second? Do you think 3D as a concept per se to visualize scenes and render stuff, is this here to stay, or do you think this might be replaced eventually let's say in the next 5 to 10 years with some sort of a three-dimensional or an understanding of a three-dimensional world and the storage thereof that is kind of quote unquote living in this latent space of machine learning, or how generative AI at the moment hallucinates kind of, for example, these three-dimensional worlds as in Sora and so on. Do you think they might coexist, or will one replace the other ones eventually? What's your opinion on this?
I think this is one of the topics where we could start philosophically talking about it forever.
Yes.
And a few things that I can say is definitely that it depends on like the application where you apply, whether it's generative AI, but also just standard sort of machine learning. Really depends on what sort of application you want to give it to. In my field, will it replace some of the tools that we have in the visual effects industry, in a visual effects pipeline? Potentially. Did the computer replace all of the people that were doing 2D animation? Well, not really. There are still studios that are doing 2D animations manually.
Yeah.
I've had the opportunity to visit some of them in Japan. Amazing studios, that they do 2D animation. But aside of that, what I think is that we've been behind polygons for a while. There is definitely the next step, around the corner. Will a scene be described with polygons in the next few years? Maybe not. And so that's where I think we are going. Whatever is that next, there could be various things that could potentially replace the polygons. But I think that there is much more to that as well. What is similar to what we discussed about procedurals. Procedurals are cool. You can have just a bunch of parameters in a recipe to describe anything. You can have faster computers, larger memory, and you can definitely have those recipes and parameters to be evaluated in real time, maybe. Do you always want that? Do you always want something that just with some parameters can actually give you, or do you want to use it maybe for authoring time and produce some polygons or whatever it is, to then keep it fixed, right? Same thing, is generative AI some other parameter? It's a matter of trying to parameterize a system that gives you something on the other side. If you look at it, it's kind of a procedural system of any sort. You can produce images, videos, whatever. How stable do you make your procedural to make building? If you move a slider, does it scramble the image every time you do it. AI improved a lot, like generative AI improved a lot, like you have stability over time. Like there is a lot more happening to just make those procedurals better and better. Now, the point is probably the same thing with the procedurals, especially for visual effects, is how much can you control them to know exactly what you're going to get at the end? Because for a one button, give me something, that's good for a nice demo, for some initial understanding of what you need to do. Like, you know, I always wanted to have a friend that was going to do some drawings of an idea of a video games that I had. Well, sure, I can use AI now. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Am I going to deliver my game with that? Maybe not. How much do you want to control it? How much do you want it to replicate the same operations? Visual effects is replicating the same steps over and over and over with slight variations on it, but over and over and over. And so that's where, you know, it's having a lot of control on the procedural system comes in handy. But OpenUSD opens a lot more possibilities. And probably OpenUSD will provide more sort of step forwards in visual effects and in a lot of other industries than generative AI and others in the short term. Long term, probably, you know, we'll see. But
I mean, nobody knows. Yeah. You just mentioned a keyword kind of in other industries also. Based on your understanding at the moment of USD, would you say it's more kind of pushed towards the kind of film industry, visual effects industry at the moment? Or is there less of an effort of pushing it into the gaming space? Because typically game engines like Unreal and Unity, they take a scene or like if it's a USD or an FBX, or like a file format, they use that just as basically the data container, and then they create all of the acceleration structures. So in this context, do you see USD is kind of equally pushed into both industries, or is there at the moment just a very strong tendency of pushing it towards animation and visual effects?
It's actually going like in a lot of industries. Like we are on the Academy Software Foundation community servers, and we have like, you know, working groups for USD in different areas. Web is going a lot with OpenUSD, you know, all the 3D application on the web. Games are like, you know, going to adopt it, but the more than adopting OpenUSD is what actually gives you, you know, over anything else. Like, you know, what USD gives you is a easier way of communicating across products. If you look at what Adobe is doing with USD, is that they try to have USD as the base 3D descriptions of everything, right? As long as you can have all of the tools to communicate with the same file format, then it's the success. But if you look at Unreal, like, what are the benefits of USD in Unreal? Would you say that Unreal in the editor will need to be able to import USD so then it has, you know, easier communication with everyone else? For sure. Do you think that Unreal as the engine, when it's running, as the runtime, should have USD inside? I don't know. Like, it will introduce dependencies, like, you know, library dependencies, maybe a bigger compiled runtime. Like, there is a lot more going on there. But what if actually the fact that you do have USD in the runtime will then let you say, oh, maybe while the game is running, you can drop a USD 3D model in the scene because you can read it on the fly. And so at that moment, like, the fact that you actually have it in the runtime opens up like other possibilities, but just because it's becoming a standard. And then USD has the benefit of being able to be opened. You can describe anything you want. And that makes it very appealing, like, you know, to try to say, what if I can describe how a factory works with a USD system with all the physics in it, and then I can replicate it in a virtual world and in the real world. Like, in that way, like, USD allows you to be that flexible that you can actually describe anything you want with it. I've spent in my channels, I've spent some time in figuring out like what I can do as a game engine fully done in USD. And I've done some tests just for the sake of experimenting with it because I love it. and it has potentials. But like the point is not what you can do, because you can pretty much do everything with it. Is whether you do want to do something with it. Interoperability is probably the one thing that it becomes, like in the VFX industry, the fact that, a client like Netflix could potentially say, with all the companies working on the same movie, say, hey, here are the assets shared as USD format. It's already a big win if you do that.
No,
instead of OBJs, let's retire OBJs.
Finally. Yeah. There's, I mean, the whole OpenUSD, it's endless. We could talk a lot more about that. And it's just, I'm curious how kind of across all of the technologies, how well it will be adapted. I really hope that there are not too many different, let's say, flavors of USD or kind of standards built on top of it, kind of that separate the different universes again afterwards. Yeah, but we'll see.
That's the easy situation which you can land if you, as a company, say we want to adopt USD.
Yeah.
If you don't just adopt it as off the shelf, then you're gonna make a custom cut of USD, and then you lose all of the benefit of having USD off the shelf. Right? If you make a custom implementation of it for your own purposes, then why going into OpenUSD? You could have had your own implementation anyway.
I do understand this, but depending on how large the company is, let's say Apple or NVIDIA, kind of this territory, or Autodesk, that they might say, hey, can do it, but we have enough advantage of doing our personal cut. I see it more in that sense.
So in the openness of the community, they shouldn't do a personal cut. They should just contribute back to the original open source repo and provide the changes that will benefit the whole community. So that's the idea.
That's also, I mean, I do get the vision, and this is also why it's called the OpenUSD, and the whole alliance kind of built around that. I just maybe sometimes I'm a little bit pessimistic.
No. They're doing it. Like, look, they're doing it. Like, I talk to friends at Autodesk, at NVIDIA, and Adobe. Like, they do contribute, like, to the OpenUSD repo. So, we are all trying to keep that as a principle.
Yeah. It's good to hear it from you. All right. But let's talk a little bit about, just very briefly, about your life, your hobbies. So with the new gig, you decided to actually stay in New Zealand, right? And so your roots grow deep there, together with the ends. And so you mentioned at the very beginning, obviously, you are originally from Italy. You mentioned you wouldn't probably move back over the last 16 years. You've been there. Do you see any other place on the planet that maybe, again, Italy, that would be an allure of potentially moving, obviously with all of the dependencies that you have?
I think, like, if we move, we will move, but if we do it, it's going to be to get back to Europe somewhere. There is no interest at the moment, like, in moving in somewhere else that is still far away from sort of families, brothers and sisters and whatever. And being in Europe will be definitely the best move that we could do. And we were actually kind of doing that. And then, some plans have changed, and, maybe we'll see. We'll see if in 1 year or so, maybe we'll move back to Europe.
Yeah. All right. And then other things that you do in your spare time. I mean, I see guitar back there.
I play a little bit. I play guitar like once in a while, but I also have some vintage passion. Like, I have my Commodore 64, my Commodore 16, my Neo Geo here. So I do a little bit of vintage playing and coding, but mostly, like, I really do as well, like, USD when I can. But if I'm not at my desk, then I'm outside trying places for lunch or dinner with my wife, or going to the gym. That's pretty much my day, let's say.
Nice. Also doing something for health, which is obviously fantastic.
Yeah, gym every morning, otherwise I can't start the day. It's not going to be easy without the gym.
Nice. That's a very, very good attitude. Cool. So the last, let's say, official question regarding hobbies and so on. So what's the most relaxing thing you can recommend to do? Kind of just to chill out after a hard day?
I would say just like either if you are not a person that would go outside, then just get your headphones on and, some good music and just have something that switches off your brain. Like, depending on how the day was, you definitely want to switch off the brain. But if you want to get out, then I would suggest go running with the headphones on. That's probably one thing that helped me. I go running and I found running like one of the best thing to do, to just listen to my synthwave, maybe metal synthwave music, but that sort of relaxes me. And actually it's weird because that is where I sort of try to go with the rhythm of the music and it helps like even running. And I think that's the one thing that I would suggest. Music, more music in our life.
Yeah. Cool. All right. I would say let's wrap it up with the typical final questions that I usually have. You mentioned one book before, but in general, so kind of if you would recommend a book everybody should read, which one would it be?
I think one interesting one that I've read, and it was funny because that has been sort of suggested to me when I became head of department, as a way to understand people a bit more, is Surrounded by Idiots. It's actually despite the title, it's a book by behavioral expert, Thomas Erikson. I think it's Thomas Erikson. And it basically describes 4 different sort of type of persons, type of behaviors in person and how to understand them, how to identify them and understand them. And it's interesting, it sort of shows, well, first of all, you have an understanding of where you sit in those 4 different type of behaviors. But then in a good way, it makes you sort of be better in socializing with others. Otherwise, I mostly read technical manual. I love graphic novels as a way of sort of switching off my brain, just to leave that moment and that's it. But otherwise, technical manuals are kind of what I read the most nowadays, probably.
Comes with the territory.
Well, there are some very good and some very bad ones. I think nowadays everyone writes technical manuals of various different things, and it becomes a problem to try to find the good ones.
I remember about 3 years ago, I bought a book by a relatively young author on video game development, and after 5 pages, I closed the book and said, "Fuck this shit." It's you're too young to be able to talk about this stuff. Go away.
I actually bought the guide to the classical adventure games. It's I don't know if any of this game reminds you of anything, but where is it? This is pretty much a Bible of how most of our graphic adventure games, have been developed and done, and the stories behind it. And it's interesting. It's an interesting book.
Very cool. Very cool. Definitely also going on the list now. All right, cool. So second question usually is, if you could change one thing on this planet to make it a better place, what would it be? I would assume pushing USD everywhere, right? So that's one of the things.
Let's be polite and say yes, maybe that one. Does it involve removing people from the planet as well as a solution, or?
Well, if it helps, it helps. I would agree. Could also name a few.
No, I don't know. There is probably a lot. But maybe to stay on the VFX and OpenUSD sort of similarities, we should be better at standards.
Yeah.
Like maybe that's the one thing. Like I've had to deal with a lot of standards that were not standards, that if they were standards, that would have solved a lot of my problems in the past.
Yeah. No, fully agree. Better standards. That's a good one, and a short one. Very last one. Who would you like to see as another guest eventually on the 3D Environment podcast?
Oh, that is good. I think like it would be good to get like some of the. There are a couple of very expert artists, like that I've had the opportunity to work with at Wētā, and some of them have very interesting stories. As what they've done in the past. That could be a chance of getting more people from Wētā, but I think like not just visual effects, and so it could be someone like from the games industry. It would be definitely nice. If you want specific names, I don't know, I've got too many names that
doesn't need to be specific names. I mean, we'll stay in contact via email anyway, so you can also send me a couple of names there. But yeah, I mean, in general, visual effects is just one industry, right? And because this is the 3D Environment podcast, this goes into a lot of different industries, right? Yeah, no, all right. Thank you so much for your time and wisdom.
No worries.
And any last comments, thoughts from your end that you want to share?
I mean, that was really good. I was surprised by your background. I don't know if you were shooting anything on the green screen. But it reminded me of some of the games that, like, I play a lot of escape games. And we do the real life one, and some of them had like that sort of background where you are in this sort of weird underground with some green panels everywhere, and I need to find like hints. And I was trying to look at your background and look at like, okay, what is that? If I move that one, maybe it opens something else.
It actually, I am recording in my studio in the basement. There's this little area that is a kind of the archive for documents, and for the like webinars and so on, I have the green screen that is set up so that the camera can look at it properly, not like right at the moment. But yeah, technically it is a bomb shelter from originally when the house was built in the 50s. Back then, it was mandatory to have a bomb shelter.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
I can see. I can definitely see why.
Yeah.
Sweet.
No, cool. Thank you so much again. And
thanks, man. Really appreciated this chat.
Yeah. I wish you a lovely evening.
And a good rest, like beginning of your day.
Yeah, I'm just going to get started now. All right.
Sweet.
Thank you so much.
It's good to see you, man.
Bye-bye.
Ciao, ciao.